This lecture begins the final unit of our course on mysticism in the great monotheistic religions of the West. In an all too brief survey of mysticism in Judaism and Christianity, we found, perhaps to our surprise, how central to both religions was this sort of deeply personal devotion that I here call mysticism. This central role is no less evident in Islam, as we discover at once as we consider Muhammad the Prophet as mystic. Before turning to the figure who occupies a place within Islam perhaps greater than that of Moses within Judaism, and perhaps less than that of Jesus in Christianity, a few preliminary words are necessary. We must acknowledge immediately that in the present historical context, the understanding of Islam as a religion is both important and difficult. It is easy to recognize past and present importance of Islam in world history. Islam's sudden rise in the 7th century of the Common Era and its astonishing success as a religious political movement over the next centuries was matched by its intellectual and cultural influence. For centuries, Islamic society represented the best in scientific, philosophical, medical, and literary endeavors. Both Judaism and Christianity needed to respond to its challenge during the Middle Ages. Both Judaism and Christianity learned from Islam. And in the contemporary world, the geopolitical significance of Islam, particularly in its more assertive forms, is impossible to ignore. What I mean by geopolitical significance, of course, is the key political importance of the oil-rich countries of the Middle East, a Middle East that is tragically conflicted, and in which Muslims make up a very large part of the population. By assertive forms of Islam, of course, I have in mind the aggressive stance of certain fundamentalist versions of Islam. All of this is impossible to ignore. Unfortunately, however, that precise political importance tends to obscure the worldwide religious significance of Islam. Islam is neither simply Arabic, nor is it simply Middle Eastern. It is found throughout the world. And it is important precisely as a religion, that is, a way of life organized around convictions and experiences concerning ultimate power. It is as a religion that it attracts and holds the allegiance of a very substantial portion of the world's population today. The difficulties in studying Islam for outsiders is partly due to historical bias and partly due to degrees of cultural distance for most observers. Christians in particular are guilty of deep bias toward Islam in language and in practice. In the Middle Ages, Christian literature portrayed Muhammad the Prophet as Mahut, a demonic figure. Over a period of some 500 years, Christian kings and pontiffs organized, launched, and carried out murderous crusades against those whom they designated as the infidels, the Muslims who lived in Palestine and Egypt, in an effort to recover the Holy Land for Christendom. The very term Mohammedanism, which many Christians use for Islam, is an example of cultural hegemony, of Orientalism, refusing to accept Islam's self-designation and rather imposing a designation which implies that Muhammad plays the same role within this religion as Jesus the Christ does within Christianity. But even beyond those elements of cultural bias, Christians simply do not know much about Islam. Until quite recently, linguistic and cultural barriers have kept outsiders from a genuine engagement with Islam. Until the mid-20th century, Islam seemed to many outsiders truly a world apart, literally exotic, something that happened somewhere else, rather than a major part of world politics, much less a religious tradition that one might encounter at Walmart, or even more certainly, one's children encounter on a regular basis in city playgrounds. The importance of Islam and the importance of understanding Islam, in short, is not connected simply to world political dimensions, but rather is connected to the fact that we live in a global universe in which all religious traditions need to understand and engage each other. So it is important from the start to make an initial adjustment in perspective. We call Islam a Western religion, not because of its location, but because of its structure. Geographically, Islam does dominate in the Middle East, to be sure, but it equally dominates in North Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa and in those Central Asian countries which were formerly Soviet republics. It dominates in Pakistan, and huge amounts of Muslims are found in India and in Malaysia. And it is a strong minority population in Europe and the Americas. Demographically, Islam embraces all the ethnic groups on the globe. It is truly a world religion in the very manner that Christianity is. So it is not geography or demographics that make it a Western religion. It is rather the type of religion it is. It belongs with Judaism and Christianity because of its characteristic features. Its belief in one God. It is the most radically monotheistic of Western religions. Its belief that this one God, Allah, has created the world, that Allah has revealed himself to humans, that Allah has revealed himself to humans in history through commandments which humans are to observe, and that humans are to respond to Allah in faith and obedience, and on the basis of that response, face an eternal destiny of heaven and hell. All of these convictions, which are found also in Judaism and Christianity, at least in their traditional forms, are found in Islam in a vision that is both simple and stringent. Indeed, it is the very simplicity and seriousness of Islam on these points that make it such an appealing religious tradition for many in today's world. Now, although, as we shall see, this religion internally traces its beginnings to the beginnings of humanity with Adam, it is proper to say that in every respect, Islam can look to the prophet of God, the Rasul of Allah, Muhammad, as its founder. His dates are 570 of the Common Era to 632. Like Moses and Jesus, Muhammad, his name means highly praised, is subject to intense interpretation within the tradition, which makes a historical reconstruction of his life laborious. There are two main sources for information about Muhammad. The Quran contains many elements concerning the figure of the prophet, but in a non-systematic and often elusive manner. There is no biography of the prophet within the Quran. Rather, the information about the prophet must be derived from indirect, elusive, and poetic statements about his own experiences on one side, and then inferences that might be drawn about the situations the prophet addressed, the problems, the opponents whom the prophet addressed in various statements within the Quran. But all of this is quite unsystematic. We could not, in fact, derive any true biography of the prophet from the Quran alone. The Quran must be supplemented by the Hadith. Hadith are stories concerning the prophet. They are often stories that contain also sayings of the prophet in the manner of the ancient Greco-Roman Creia, or the stories that are called the apothegms in the Gospels. There is a biographical setup, there is a development of that setup, and then often there is an authoritative statement by the prophet. So these are hadith, and these stories about the prophet proliferated after his death. Tens of thousands of them accumulated, and by the year 800, there were 200,000 of these hadith in circulation. It was one of the first and great critical acts of scholarship within Islam to try to bring about some order in the hadith, to distinguish between authentic and inauthentic hadith. It was the work of al-Bukhari that brought down those 200,000 hadith to a massive but more manageable number of 73,000 hadith. And the means used, fascinatingly, is very much the same technique used by Jewish scholars tracing the transmission of their traditions in the Talmud. My teacher heard it from his teacher, who heard it from his teacher, and you trace it back to the family of the prophet or the associates of the prophet or one of the prophet's wives. And on that basis, it is deemed as more authoritative than not. Now, in the contemporary Islamic world, there is a tension between more liberal and more conservative Muslims concerning the degree to which the techniques and methods of Western historiography should be employed in analyzing and sorting through these traditions. My standpoint is one that, at least in order to describe the prophet's life in some orderly manner, it is necessary to use some of the historiographical elements of modernity. Now we turn to that life. The significance of Muhammad's mission and his accomplishment is best measured against its historical backdrop, which is pre-Islamic Arabia. It was experiencing a profound social dislocation that was being caused by a shift from Bedouin existence to merchant existence, from rural life to urban life. The great trade routes in luxury goods, especially cloths and jewels and spices that made their way along the coast of the Arabian Sea from oasis to oasis and stopped at cities such as Medina and Mecca, increased population and wealth in those locations. The religious context was one of native polytheism. The many gods of the pre-Islamic Arabian Peninsula. There were also present in that context some elements of Judaism and of Christianity. The Christians tended to belong to dissident groups, those who had left the empire because the Christian empire was repressive with regard to heresies. And so marginal Christian groups tended to locate themselves in East Syria, Arabia, and so forth, outside the reach of the Holy Roman Emperor. So, for example, the Quran shows knowledge of what we recognize as being Christian apocryphal gospels, not the four canonical gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but such gospels as the apocryphal Gospel of Thomas, which has the marvelous story, which is alluded to in the Quran, of Jesus changing clay into birds that fly away. Muhammad's hometown was Mecca, and part of its importance was not simply an important location on the trade route, but that it housed the shrine called the Kaaba, which was controlled by wealthy families of the city. And one of the things that bothered Muhammad was the degree of what he regarded as falling away from traditional Bedouin virtues in this new urban context. The Kaaba was, of course, based on the stone that fell from heaven, the meteorite. But it was only one among several native polytheistic idols that were housed in the city of Mecca. Until he was about 40, Muhammad's early life, between 570 and 610, had elements both of normal endeavor and of religious searching. He was a member of the Quraysh tribe, but he was an orphan, and he was raised by an uncle who managed the well. Wells are extremely important in this part of the country. Managed the well called Zamzam. And the significance of this well is that it was associated in lore with the well found by Hagar and her son Ishmael, from whom Muslims trace their Abrahamic descent. Muhammad became the business manager of a woman 15 years his senior, Khadija, and married her in 595. Khadija is of extraordinary importance for the development of this movement on three counts. First, she was an immediate and powerful supporter of the Prophet emotionally. Second, she was a woman who had a cousin who happened to be Christian, and therefore was in contact with at least some elements of Christian lore, the Christian story, knew about prophets. Thirdly, her financial stability enabled Muhammad to pursue his religious vocation. During these years, disturbed by the religious and moral corruption that he perceived in the city, Muhammad periodically sought solitude and spent the night in prayer at Mount Hira, covered with his cloak, or as the Quran puts it, wrapped in a mantle. His decisive call to be a prophet occurred in the year 610, and in the perspective of this course must be called a mystical experience. It is an encounter with the divine mediated by the angel Gabriel, Jibril, and we find an elusive account of it in the Quran in Surah 53, verses 4 through 12. It is naught save an inspiration that is inspired, which one of mighty powers hath taught him, one vigorous. And he grew clear to view when he was on the uppermost horizon. Then he drew nigh and came down till he was distant 2 bows' length, or even nearer. And he revealed unto his slave that which he revealed. The heart lieth not in seeing what it saw. Will ye then dispute with him concerning what he seeth? According to the Hadith, Muhammad was at first not entirely sure what the significance of this encounter was. He consulted with Khadija, and she helps him understand the significance of his experience, namely that Muhammad is called to be a prophet, a Rasul of Allah, and to proclaim that Allah alone is God to all people, and that all should submit. The term submission is Islama. They should submit to Allah in all of their life. And at the very beginning, this message has a very powerful eschatological aspect. You must submit because Allah is going to bring judgment. And so we read in Surah 96, which is entitled The Clot, which was revealed at Mecca. Read, in the name of thy Lord who createth man from a clot, read. And thy Lord is the most bounteous who teacheth by the pen.
teacheth man that which he knew not. Nay, but verily man is rebellious, that he thinketh himself independent. Lo, unto thy Lord is the return. Hast thou seen him who dissuadeth a slave when he prayeth? Hast thou seen if he relieth on the guidance of Allah, or enjoineth piety? Hast thou seen if he denieth Allah's guidance and is froward? Is he then unaware that Allah seeth? Nay, but if he cease not, we will seize him by the forelock, the lying, sinful forelock. Then let him call upon his henchmen. We will call the guards of hell. Nay, obey not thou him, but prostrate thyself and draw near unto Allah. And again in Surah 74, revealed at Mecca, called the Cloaked One, O thou enveloped in thy cloak, arise and warn. Thy Lord magnify, thy raiment purify, pollution shun. And show not favor, seeking worldly gain. For the sake of thy Lord be patient, for when the trumpet shall sound, surely that day will be a day of anguish, not of ease, for disbelievers. And then he continues in lines 53 to 56, Nay, verily, they fear not the hereafter. Nay, verily, lo, this is an admonishment, so whosoever will may heed. And they will not heed unless Allah willeth it. He is the fount of fear. He is the fount of mercy. And finally, in Surah 73, again revealed at Mecca, entitled The Enshrouded One. O thou wrapped in thy raiment, keep vigil the night long. Save a little, a half thereof, or abate a little thereof, or add a little thereto, and chant the Qur'an in measure. For we shall charge thee with a word of weight. Lo, the vigil of the night is a time when impression is more keen and speech more certain. So remember the name of thy Lord, and devote thyself with a complete devotion. Lord of the east and the west, there is no God save him. So choose thou him alone for thy defender. Lo, we have sent unto you a messenger, as witness against you, even as we sent unto Pharaoh a messenger. Lo, thy Lord knoweth how thou keepest vigil, sometimes nearly 2/3 of the night, or sometimes half or a third thereof, as do a party of those with thee. Allah measureth the night and the day. He knoweth that ye count it not, and turneth unto you in mercy. Recite then of the Qur'an that which is easy for you. He knoweth that there are sick folk among you, while others travel in the land in search of Allah's bounty, and others still are fighting for the cause of Allah. So recite of it that which is easy for you, and establish worship, and pay the poor tax, and so lend unto Allah a goodly loan. After these opening encounters, and after initial rejection, the prophet's message eventually spread by means of teaching, battle, and negotiation throughout Arabia before his death. For 12 years in Mecca, Muhammad's message had little success. He was mocked. He was followed only by a few, mainly the members of his family. The key date is the year 622, when Muhammad, with some of his followers called the emigrants, carried out the hijrah, which is his flight from Mecca to Medina, where he establishes the new center of Islam and where the populace welcomed him. So those who went with him are called emigrants. Those who welcomed him in Medina are called helpers. The hijrah is the first date of the Muslim calendar. Muslim dating begins with the Common Era year 622. And note how the reason why it is significant is not because of what happened to Muhammad, but because of the acceptance of the message of Muhammad, where a Muslim state begins to be formed. From Medina, Muhammad continues to recite the Quran and begins to extend the rule of Islam throughout Arabia. And in 629 and 630, Muhammad, with 10,000 troops, conquers Mecca, is received triumphantly, and having completed his farewell pilgrimage, he returns to Medina, where he dies in 632. Now, although Muhammad is, as Montgomery Watt says in his book, a prophet and statesman, he is a founder and organizer, he can also be regarded as a mystic. He was not an ascetic. The dietary rules for Muslims are not physical mortification, but discipline in obedience to Allah. There is a hadith to the effect that there are no monks in Islam, and Muhammad died with many wives, apparently very happily. Yet the revelation of the Quran continued throughout his life, suggesting frequent, if not constant, mystical attention and concentration on Allah. And tradition holds that Muhammad had a very special mystical night journey to Jerusalem, the Isra, and an ascent to heaven called the Mi'raj. We will discuss these in a later presentation, but we can see in the Surah 53, where we recounted that initial encounter, that it continues, and verily he saw him yet another time by the lot tree of the utmost boundary, nigh unto which is the garden of abode. When that which shroudeth did enshroud the lot tree, the eye turned not aside, nor yet was overbold. Verily he saw one of the greater revelations of his Lord. For Muslims, the great miracle associated with Muhammad is the Quran itself. It is